And we're good to go.
So our first workshop today will be Dr. Raha Hakamdabar.
Okay, so should I start talking now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to try one more time to share my screen. Otherwise, I'm just going to use voice chat. And yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I'm not sure why it's not letting me.
I think you have to go outside in the settings in the Mac OS. Change, make permissions for screen sharing on. But I guess talking's just fine.
Okay, let's do that. And I'm happy to present, the presentation later on if that's helpful. So we can definitely try to get that the actual presentation out to people if it's going to be helpful. So, okay, I'm going to get started. And thank you all for being here early in the morning. I don't know what time zone everybody is in, but hopefully you're not on West Coast time zone because that would be quite early. So I am Raha Hakamdabar. I am the Director of Space Sciences at Ball Aerospace and formerly was a hydrologist and acting National Program Lead at the U.S. Forest Service. So largely my background, actually I'll go through my background just by way of introduction so you know who I am. So I am an earth scientist. I'm a hydrologist, and my background is actually originally in civil engineering. So I got my bachelor's in civil engineering. I worked as an engineer for a few years and then decided to go to grad school and eventually get a PhD in hydrology. And my research focused on really trying to understand the relationship around water and land. So I was interested in understanding how our land cover and land use changes, for example, deforestation, or even in some cases, reforestation, impacts our water cycle, impacts the amount of, our kind of water challenges that we have, so to speak. So, okay. And I just want to make sure you all don't have video, right? You just have my voice.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry, it's my first time using Discord, so I'm probably just asking really silly questions. So sorry about that. Okay, so back to kind of my background, and then from the research side of things, I wanted to really have an impact and work with both the management side of land and water management, as well as the policy side of land and water management. So I did a few things to get me into that world. I consulted with, kind of on the international side, was a consultant with the United Nations Environment Program and the World Bank, working on projects in the Caribbean that mainly dealt with issues of course, it's no surprise, a lot of floods, a lot of challenges that came out of I guess poor, land management practices. There was a lot of deforestation in the islands where I was working, a lot of issues around urban planning, and basically where people lived in areas that were in the danger zone. They were in flood-prone areas. So there was just a lot of really high risk in the areas where I was working in terms of floods, and then also any kind of extreme, also droughts. So the Caribbean is also prone to periods of drought, and so really a lot of challenges. But it was very interesting for me to be able to work with such big organizations that are able to have an impact on the ground, or at least try to, through partnership with countries, with as well as with NGOs and more smaller local organizations. And then that kind of got me interested in the U.S. policy side of things, and I joined the federal government as a presidential management fellow. which is a 2-year program that brings people with advanced degrees into the federal government and lets you kind of spend time with different agencies. So I spent time with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Forest Service, which is where I'll talk more about that, and then also with the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. So a lot of my work centered around the policy side and the management side of water and land management, but also, especially my science background, my work with NASA led to utilizing what's called Earth observations or remote sensing data that can come from satellites as well as airborne vehicles. And that data can be super powerful because it can really give us a lot of information about what's going on, how we can look at things like floods, we can look at things like droughts, we can look at trends, changes over time, and really put into perspective, one, what we're seeing on the ground, and two, help us make decisions that are more informed, more robust, and really built around the science. Okay, so and then all of that kind of, and the Forest Service, I ended up staying there and doing a lot of work around hydrology and forest management, which very challenging but very, very important. So I'll talk a little bit about why that's important, and then lastly, what kind of brought me to Ball Aerospace, and my current position is kind of being on the side of creating, I became really interested on the technology side and on the instruments that we're using to study the Earth, and as well as other places as well. But a large part of the work that I do is focused around Earth science and helping us understand the climate change, and what instruments do we currently have that are able to help us monitor and make sense of changes in the climate, and as well as other changes like land and water, and monitoring the oceans. There's just so much we can do from the vantage point of space, and then secondly, it's then helping us make decisions around to address the climate crisis, as well as other things, because that's ultimately the key here for us to figure out some solutions. And really, that's why you're here today, is to come up with some creative solutions for us, and to think through some of the major challenges that we're facing as a society, as the entire world. Okay, so I did say I wanted to really make the connection between some of the aspects of the challenge that you're going to be focusing on, and kind of the bigger work that I've done, especially from the Forest Service perspective. So a few things that I wanted to note for you to keep in mind today. One is really try to make sure you are making the connection between the technical challenges that we're facing, especially when it comes to water-related challenges, whether it's inland or it's in the oceans. Think about the technical side of it. What are the tools that we have? What are the challenges that we have technically, and potentially some solutions around that. But also, making that connection to the policy side, because that is a really important connection for us to make, and that's how we can, in theory, not always, but in theory, we can make some big, lasting impact, change. The Environmental Protection Agency has been able to have help us have really big impacts as a nation in terms of how we protect our natural resources. And their job is to regulate. They're a regulatory agency, and without that, it would be it's kind of like a question of scales, right? It would be difficult for us to necessarily scale those local solutions up to the national level, which is where we really see a big impact especially over time. So, so that's one thing to know, that make sure, you're thinking about the technical, but as well as the policy. And then, and also, another important aspect of it is the management side. So, who's going to do it, and how much will it cost? Those are very realistic challenges, especially, in my work at the Forest Service. And really anywhere, you have to work within certain boundaries, right? And your boundaries typically end up being money and people to actually do all the things that you want to do. So just keeping in mind those things as you're going through the day. And then the other thing that I really wanted to talk about is the concept of nature-based solutions. So if you're unfamiliar with the term, don't worry. It's a term that's really popular in Europe, and we are starting to use it here as well. But we use other terminology, so it's not like we're not doing work around it, or we haven't been. Essentially, what it means is a set of solutions that are, tied to us working with nature rather than us working against nature. So what that manifests itself as, for example, in a city, is addressing our stormwater and flooding challenges in urban areas with with not just what's called gray infrastructure, like built systems, but also with green infrastructure. And green infrastructure includes things like green roofs, green streets, bioswales, right-of-way bioswales, even parks. It just public spaces that are vegetated rather than concrete and asphalt. And so, I mean, of course, you may already know why that is. It's now pretty intuitive, but it took us a while to figure this out, that when we built our cities, we built them to be, completely going against the natural hydrological system, which means we put down, concrete on what was before either vegetated or bare soil ground. And so, of course, that means that because you're not able to, the water, let's say it rains, the water's not able to penetrate into the ground, and follow the natural system, become groundwater flow, and some of it becomes goes in the ground, some of it stays on top of the ground, and then eventually makes its way to bigger water bodies, and eventually like the oceans. So we really went against that natural hydrological system when we designed our cities. And many of our kind of approaches were just really going against nature. So this idea of nature-based solutions is to learn from the natural systems, and to increase our, for example, urban areas or our city's ability to absorb water. You may have heard, this idea of a sponge city, some buzzword like that, which basically means, areas, urban areas that are able to more closely follow the natural hydrology and allow for the water, let's say when it rains, to actually infiltrate into the ground instead of directly becoming stormwater. And it's like one additional challenge on why that's important in many of our dense urban areas, like our big cities, New York City, even Washington, D.C., which is where I live, and elsewhere, is because our cities in the eastern part of the United States are much older. They were built a long time ago. They were designed with a very different population in mind. We didn't think that our cities would grow to be as big as they have. And so what the city's sewer systems were originally designed to have a single sewer pipe, single pipe that would basically manage both of our water that comes from our homes, like from washing machines, from just washing the dishes, from toilets, as well as rainwater. So they go to the same single pipe, right, underground pipe. And the challenge with that is, as we've seen our population just balloon, right, in our urban centers, and as we have, like I mentioned, changed the natural hydrology, and on top of that, we have a risk multiplier, which is climate change. We are seeing more intense rainfall happening in many of our key urban areas, our cities, which are, of course, also located on the coast. So that's another challenge. But we're seeing just a lot more water going into these single sewer systems than we used to, right? Than they were designed for. So what this means is that when we have these periods of really intense rainfall, and sometimes even it doesn't even take that much rainfall, but you can have an event called a combined sewer overflow. So a combined sewer overflow basically means that that water, which is a mix of our wastewater, water coming from our homes and other places, as well as the rainwater, it basically just gets dumped into nearby water bodies. So, for example, where I did my master's and PhD work at Columbia University in New York. So in New York City, at times you could actually, I would be walking by the river and by the Hudson River, and I could actually smell that the water smelled different, after a particular rainfall event. So that's a huge problem, right? And it's a grand challenge because it's very costly and very challenging to try to now separate those systems when they're already underground. And imagine, what a complex challenge that is in a city like New York, for you to just, stop all operations and try to dig up the pipes and just, it's a very, very big challenge. And so what we have been trying to do is to address the challenge, not by this very expensive solution that would be just digging up the ground and trying to recreate the entire system that was built a long time ago, the underground system, but to introduce green infrastructure, to introduce nature-based solutions to address our stormwater challenges in the city. And so many cities around the US and around the world are doing the same thing. So I wanted you to, kind of think about that as you're going through the challenges that there's this movement in engineering and as well as in urban planning, and I think just in our societies, to think more green. And that's a good thing, because on top of the water benefits that we would have from introducing nature-based solutions to address our challenges, we also have a number of other co-benefits that come. So addressing things like the urban heat island effect, the water pollution. There have been studies that have looked at, how it could help with biodiversity in areas like, green roofs have been shown to attract more bees, which is good. And, like, bees are pollinators; they're a really important part of a healthy ecosystem. And so all of these, different like co-benefits. Oh, and also the health. There have been some studies looking at the relationship between more green spaces let's say in cities where you typically have less of them, and human health, things like asthma. And they have found, links between human health and more green spaces. So really important, an active area, and really an area where we need to have more creative solutions. And then the other thing that I wanted to touch at is this connection between a local area. So let's say you're really interested in a challenge within a city, like addressing stormwater challenges within a city. Say it's New York City. It's really important for you to consider the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, as from a hydrologist perspective, is to look at the watershed, which, where that city sits. So a watershed is just, if you're not familiar, it's just basically a hydrological unit of measure, which is like, physically dividing up the land into in ways that make sense, following the natural topography and the flow of water. So it's like a beautiful, very philosophical way to look at the landscape, right? You just follow the flow of the water and you draw a boundary around that. and it's really important to look at the bigger picture, because a lot of times, like the work that I did at the Forest Service, it dealt with the upper part of the watershed, right? Because our national forests, or forests in general, they tend to be located in higher elevations. They tend to be located in what's called the headwaters, right, where the water originates from. So those are really important areas. So if you you may let's say you fix all your problems in a isolated location, like say in your city, and you have issues upstream, you have issues in the upper part of your watersheds. Let's say you've had deforestation happen, and which affects things like the soil, and it's it just leads to a lot of challenges, including water quality, as well as increased risk of flooding. So that what happens in the upper part of your watershed, and really in any part of your watershed, is going to affect everything downstream, right? Like, so people tend to live most of our urban centers are downstream, in downstream areas. So we really rely on the upstream parts of our watersheds, like providing us with resilience, and also with resources, because again, taking the example of New York City, New York City's water largely comes from protected watershed, protected part of natural land in the upper part of their watershed, and so it's like completely a kind of a gravity-fed system, which is very beautiful and elegant in the way that New York City kind of gets its water. But that area is really important, because what you do upstream is going to affect what happens downstream. Okay, so in the last, I think I have like 3 more minutes left, and I'm just going to make the connection now to the observations piece really quickly, so that you have it in your back pocket and just something for you to consider. As you're going through the challenges and you're looking for data, you're looking for information, I'm happy to help you locate, especially data sources that may be measurements of stream flow measurements or water quality measurements from the U.S. Geological Survey, but also remote sensing data that can be used to look at things like land conversion, land change. We have data on precipitation. We have data on let's see, we have a number of ocean-related data sets as well that come from satellites, and also some water-related things that can be data sets that we can have, we've gotten from the satellite detection. So I'm happy to serve as a resource if you have questions, any questions around anything that I just said, but also in terms of data access, I'm happy to help you with that, or any kind of statistical methods or things that you want to explore. And also I'll mention on the policy side, if you have questions on that, I'm happy to serve as a resource. And just as, to help clarify, my area of expertise is largely in the terrestrial side, less on kind of the ocean side. So I'm more inland water. So again, feel free to reach out, and I'm really excited for you to take these challenges on. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Raha. And Jeff, whenever you are ready, take your time. The next workshop will begin at 10, so keep that in mind.
So I noticed that Raha had some trouble with the screen share. I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. And go live. So I'm not sure you can see my screen or not. Can you?
No.
I can.
Oh, then maybe the problem is me.
It says climate and oceans, some perspective on carbon.
Well, we see a screen, but we don't see the full.
Okay, let me try one more thing. I know that I probably should have done this ahead of time, but 1 second. Let me try that again. Change windows. All right, let's try it this way. Okay, now can you see me?
Yeah, we see your Discord.
And can you see my screen?
Yep.
And it says climate change or climate and oceans?
Well, we see your Discord window. We don't see the presentation. So.
Okay, one more attempt. I'd like to use this if I can, but we'll see if I can or can't. Let's see. Change windows. Screens. There it is. There. Go live. Okay, now you should see it.
Gorgeous. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, so I really appreciated Raha, her presentation. It really touched on, said some very nice intersection with some of the things I'll be discussing as well. I guess I should introduce myself first. So I'm Jeff Shields. I'm the Moses D. Nunnally Distinguished Professor of Marine Science at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. I got my start body surfing for my degree at UC Santa Barbara, but I rapidly realized that that was not a good career for me, and went on in aquatic and marine biology and did a postdoc. Actually, I went to UC Berkeley for a master's, went back to Santa Barbara for a PhD, worked on crabs there, and then went to Australia where I did a postdoc. My specialty is on diseases of marine animals, and I am fascinated with how disease processes work in general, disease ecology. So you might ask why oceans and climate and carbon and such. It's because I teach marine biology, and I'm, as a parasitologist, kind of a jack of all trades and read widely in a number of things. So I'm going to give you some perspectives on carbon from the marine biology point of view. The first thing is an outline, just to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. So why carbon? And then I'm going to talk about the biological pump for how the ocean handles carbon, if you will, and a little bit about primary production. But really, I want to talk more about carbon sequestration and some of the challenges facing us in that realm. So why carbon? So as you all know, carbon dioxide is a food for plants and algae. It's really super, it's what drives photosynthesis. It's what plants use. It drives primary productivity in the oceans because the algae, the phytoplankton in the ocean are vast in quantity and fix a lot of carbon. And when we say fix carbon, the carbon dioxide is absorbed into the oceans, and then the algae then use that carbon that's in the water to make the food. They're building blocks. But carbon dioxide, we can have too much of a good thing, as you all know by now, that burning fossil fuels has released too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And the carbon dioxide basically acts as a radiator and keeps the heat inside. It would normally radiate out into space, but with carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, that heat can no longer escape. Builds up, and we're looking at a crisis. Oceans store a really vast amount of carbon, and that's because the oceans are 70 to 75% of the planet, depending on which estimate you use. The carbon dioxide is dissolved in seawater, and in fact, seawater has a really great propensity for that dissolution. It stores far more carbon dioxide than the atmosphere, and you can see that in this graphic I have here. The carbon dioxide, the percent volume in the atmosphere is only 0.03%, whereas in the oceans, it's 83%. So the oceans store just a huge amount of carbon dioxide. And it's roughly, so what's happened is the oceans have actually accumulated much of the carbon dioxide that has been released by anthropogenic emissions from fossil fuels. So the ocean has essentially been acting as a huge buffer for our air pollution, if you will. So I'm going to touch on this a little bit because it's kind of relevant to something later on. It's not a chemistry class today, but the carbonate system is basically how carbon dioxide it becomes dissolved in seawater, and then it dissociates into various forms depending on pH. And we call that the carbonate system. So when carbon dioxide is in water, it can be carbonic acid, bicarbonate, or carbonate, depending on pH and how the ions are dissociating. This actually provides a lot of buffering activity in the world's oceans, which is cool, but it can change And that change is causing some alarm now because the oceans are becoming more acidified by the presence of this carbonate, excess carbon. So a couple of central themes are swirling around, if you will, in both biological oceanography. A big one has been, how does carbon cycle in the ocean? And I'm going to talk a bit about that today. And then, how does the ocean mediate this excess carbon? And can we use that elements of biological oceanography to enhance carbon storage? And so I'm going to talk about that. This is a little graphic just to remind you that the ocean is vast and blue and filled with microorganisms that are somehow associated with this carbon dioxide and carbon fixation. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something we call the biological pump. So remember, I mentioned the carbon dioxide is dissolved into seawater. It's dissolved in seawater in the shallow ocean surface waters, where it's used by phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton fix that into organic molecules. Those are then eaten by other zooplankton, which are then eaten by fish. So you have this natural cycle of life, of course, in the surface waters. As the animals die, they become reprocessed by bacteria and fungi and things like that, what we call the microbial loop. And as they die, they sink further and further into the ocean, and so more and more carbon is sinking. I like this graphic because it shows that there's a lot of carbon at the surface of the ocean, but as you go deeper and deeper, there's less and less organic carbon that's making it to the bottom. But this is an important amount. This organic carbon that makes it to the bottom is really how the biological system is sequestering carbon in our deep ocean, and it's critical. There's also a physical pump, and this is essentially just the ventilation and exchange of carbon dioxide between ocean, the deep ocean and surface waters through natural physical processes. This biological pump is driven by both physical processes like gravity and currents, but it's the fixation of this carbon and its movement down into the deep ocean through biological processes of predation, swimming, decomposition, and so forth. Now, the biological pump is really important because you have this carbon fixation at the surface, and that carbon is moving to the bottom. And when it gets to the bottom, you have what we call remineralization happening. So the fixed carbon that makes it to the bottom, and by fixed, I mean carbon that's an organic molecule, that makes it to the bottom, and in the bottom sediments, it can become remineralized as hydrocarbons, as fossil fuels, or as mineral carbonates. So when carbon dioxide or carbonates interact with minerals or metal ions, if you will, they become mineral carbonates. And this ultimately mediates the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. It's really critical. So there have been some nice papers done showing the importance of the biological pump in terms of the global carbon cycle. And the pump has been estimated to transfer somewhere between 5 and 15 gigatons of carbon per year from surface to deep ocean interior waters. That's a lot of carbon. It's comparable to the annual increase in carbon dioxide that we see from anthropogenic remobilization, anthropogenic uses of fossil fuels. So it's a huge amount. Without the biological pump, the atmosphere would be about 200 parts per million higher in carbon dioxide, and you know where that would go. Much more warming, and we would probably not be able to live on this planet after a while. So small changes in the functioning of this biological pump could change its function or strength, and could radically affect the amount of partitioning that we expect of carbon dioxide in the oceans. And I'm going to talk about those changes a little bit next. So one of the big questions that people have been asking in biological oceanography is, can we use the ocean to sequester more carbon? Because we already know that carbon dioxide is sequestering there, and the biological pump is moving it deeper into the oceans. So I'm going to look at a couple things today with you. I'm going to look at how some biological approaches have been used. So one of them is the great iron fertilization experiments, which are really fascinating. I just love them. And kelp as carbon offsets, and ecosystem restoration, or blue carbon. Our previous speaker, Raha, had mentioned the natural-based management, or what we call blue carbon management, if you will, to enhance natural processes in removing carbon and resolving anthropogenic issues. And so this is an example of those. And then there are some chemical approaches that are not well developed, in my opinion. But first, there's an odd feature in biological oceanography that was found several decades ago. And these are areas where there's lots of nutrients in the water. These colored areas are red and green. These areas, there are lots of nutrients, lots of nitrogen in the water, but they don't support a lot of plant growth. And so this has puzzled marine biologists for several years, and they realized that there was something missing in these waters. And I also want to point out that this is satellite-generated data, that much of the modeling that was done for the iron hypothesis comes from, our understanding of using satellite imagery to look at productivity in the world's oceans. You can use that for different colors and make inferences from that. But in any case, what I have here is right in the center is, why do these areas have high nutrients but low chlorophyll? Why are there very few plankton, phytoplankton in these areas where we should see a lot more? And it's because of iron. There's basically, iron is a trace element that's super important for photosynthesis. It's used in the process of fixing carbon. So it's limiting in these areas. And so it was conjectured in the 80s, 1983, that it might be possible to actually sequester all of the man-made carbon dioxide in the world's oceans simply by fertilizing those areas, if you will, with iron. And iron is very abundant on Earth, and so this is actually quite feasible in some respects. But, does it really work? So theoretically, yes, it seems like it could. But experiments have shown where people have gone out, marine biologists have gone out in ships and literally added iron sulfates and other iron fertilizers to the water in an effort to stimulate these areas to grow. Basically, the question is, can we put iron in these iron-poor waters that have high nutrients in them and stimulate the biological pump to offset warming? And the first experiment was done in 1993. There have been 12 since then, and they've all been somewhat equivocal. So we're not really sure this will work. But the initial studies are just like, it might, but we're not sure. But the reason why you can tell iron's a trace metal here is it's very low in the surface waters where the phytoplankton occur, but it is what we call a mixed element. As you go deeper into the oceans, it becomes stable. So it's used heavily as a tracer element here in the surface waters. This is one of the experimental results that was done from what we call the Soiree expedition, where they added iron to the water. And you can see the color here shows that the path of the ship dumping iron fertilizer into the ocean was literally increasing phytoplankton production along that path. Here's a graphic image of iron fertilization. We know that iron is important, and it can be added to these waters from natural processes like mineral aerosols from dust storms and such. But the iron basically enters the system, and it binds, it's used by the cell in what's called ferredoxin to fix carbon, and it stimulates phytoplankton growth. And then those phytoplankton, decay, they die, get eaten, and so on, and that organic matter then goes to the bottom in the biological pump. So there was some evidence that this can actually work on a grand scale. There was a volcano called Pinatubo that erupted. I can't remember the year now, but 1980s rings a bell. Anyway, about 40,000 tons of iron dust were dumped into the ocean. And this led to a measurable decline in atmospheric carbon dioxide and an increase in atmospheric oxygen levels because of this iron stimulating phytoplankton growth. It enhanced the planktonic community. So in areas where you don't see iron, you have a phytoplankton community that's dominated by cyanobacteria, not a particularly rich environment, if you will. But when you add iron, you see a much different community, a much more productive community. And so if you look at this little cartoon here with the orange coloration, that shows an enhancement of the organic matter that resulted from that. So more carbon. There's a legal issue with this, and this is one of the challenges that I think is important, is there was a company called Planktos that formed in an effort to actually start undertaking iron fertilization experiments on a grand scale. In 2007, they dumped about 100 tons of iron sulfate into the ocean. And this resulted in increased algal growth over a fairly large area, measurable area. However, it has some critics, and the critics have a point. This is actually in violation of UN laws on the dumping of wastes at sea. So one of the things that we're going to have to overcome with many of the sorts of green solutions that we may have is that there may be legal ramifications. And so we need to make sure that we have processes in place to understand those and work with it. I'm going to switch gears here and talk a little bit more about some other blue solutions, or green solutions, if you will. And I love this idea of using kelp in a number of different ways, because kelp is a phenomenal, it's an algae, it's a brown algae. And I'm just using kelp here to mean macroalgae, large grand scale algae, if you will. But kelp has many, many uses. If you like sushi, you're already eating a form of kelp called nori. And so we eat it as food. We use it for animal fodder. It's used in medicines. It's used as fertilizers, personal skincare products, nutraceuticals, and in many industrial uses for things like lubrication. And it's cultured already in many regions for exactly these purposes. What people may not realize is that some of the fodders that are produced by algae actually reduce methane production in livestock. This may sound like a silly thing, but methane production by cattle is a major source of greenhouse gas. Our production of cattle in livestock is a major source of greenhouse gas on the planet. Algae can also be used to control ocean acidification, and it's being used in areas where you have shellfish aquaculture now to help control acidification from too much carbon dioxide in the water. What I really like about the use of algae is it's got all these great uses that I've just mentioned, but some new thinking has been going on about using algae to actually convert that carbon into a source that can be sunk into the deep oceans rather quickly. And so the idea is you grow the carbon up, you grow the algae, and then you sink it to the bottom in deep areas. Of course, this will have some potential ramifications to those bottom areas. We have to do this with some thought, but it does offer some possibilities. One of the things I forgot to mention about this kelp, this particular species that I'm showing you in this picture, can grow 2 feet per day. Yeah, you heard me right, 2 feet per day. These leaves that you see here can grow 2 feet per day. It's a remarkable amount of biomass that can be produced by this. And if you don't believe me that this is happening, there's a company in Maine that is currently doing this. They're taking and they use floats, and these are floats made out of plant material, cellulose, that they're growing the kelp on strings. The idea is to then take it offshore and sink it down into the deep water, where you're basically taking that carbon dioxide from the surface areas and sinking it into deep ocean. And I think this is a remarkable, really remarkable innovation. And if you think about it, it's really green, except we do need to know what the impact of the carbon kelp in those deep water areas will be. It's some study that has to be done, but it's really fascinating. This could be used in a number of ways. We have carbon offsets. So if companies are still producing carbon dioxide and need to purchase offsets, that might drive this industry further. And I think that's fantastic. We have sequestration of carbon, basically the same thing as the offsets, but it can be used in different ways. We have farming. So you also have the potential for food or fodder or those other things I've mentioned as well. So I think this is really great. I think we're going to see more of this in the future. And then the last sort of green technology I want to talk about is something that the previous speaker, Raha, had mentioned, and that has to do with the natural-based developments. This one's more ecosystem derived, and that is what we call blue carbon. So blue carbon is basically capturing carbon, that's captured by marine and coastal ecosystems. And so this really sort of exemplifies why we need to restore and maintain our critical coastal ecosystems. Those areas store a lot of carbon, and they store carbon in the sediments, essentially. If you think about, if you need an example of this that you can't quite get your head around, think about a peat bog and all of the carbon that's stored in a peat bog. Well, salt marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, these all store an incredible amount of carbon in the sediments. that is basically buried by sediments after, from the root mats and so on. It amounts to a few 100 million tons of carbon dioxide annually, so it's maybe small compared to some of the things that we need. For example, the idea of the iron fertilization. But blue carbon still has many benefits, and one of those is we basically need to conserve our ecosystems, these ecosystems, because they provide additional services, not just the sequestration of carbon. They provide services in the reduction of coastal erosion and flooding. And I know one of the major challenges in the EcoHack group today is stormwater management. And so here, if you can somehow restore or improve your coastal zone, habitats, you have a chance of sort of facilitating these reductions. They also improve water quality, and they can, of course, support coastal livelihoods and tourism. There are some chemical approaches to carbon sequestration. I mentioned how iron, binds with carbon dioxide to make iron carbonates. Well, there are other metals that do that and other processes that do that. And so there's been some thought as to using chemical additions to marine systems, other chemical additions to marine systems that can react with carbonates to produce mineral carbonates. And I think this is certainly interesting and worth pursuing. And iron, of course, is a good means for doing that. There may be some electrochemical approaches as well, basically running a current through certain reagents to remove carbon dioxide also can produce hydrogen. And so there's some idea of using electrochemical approaches to produce hydrogen and sequester carbon dioxide. So I think that these are all sort of things that have to happen for us to move forward. And so what I see as grand needs in the very near future is we need more STEM innovation to reduce carbon dioxide and other gases in the system. Right now, we're simply putting too much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The ocean can only absorb so much. One thing I didn't mention is that the absorption rate for carbon dioxide means that the ocean is, once we manage to limit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from our own inputs, the ocean's going to start releasing it back into the atmosphere. And so we're going to have a lot of carbon dioxide to deal with over the next several centuries. We also need some policies and legislation to navigate roadblocks. And this has to be done with a critical eye so that we're not abusing systems. We're making it so we're advancing our green priorities. And lastly, we need to prioritize these actions to reduce carbon dioxide now. It's nearly too late. And so that's why we need some more innovation and what I like to call hard thinking to advance us forward. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, you can contact me at jeff@vims.edu or through the organizers here today. Thank you very much. Okay, so are you guys there?